Hello, we are today at the French Left Party, and we received the journalist Alexander Lipen, who is coming back from the east of Ukraine. So can you introduce yourself and your work?
I'm Alexander Lipen. I have been researching the situation in Ukraine, the situation about the civil war going on there, and I'm as well an international lawyer, so for me it has been very interesting to see how the new government, which has self-proclaimed itself, how it is being formed, because this is one of very few occasions in history where you as a professional can see what is actually going on in reality.
Okay, so we will start about talking about what can be called maybe an information war. Can we explain us what the concept of information war refers to and how this applies to the current situation in Ukraine?
Yes, the idea of information war is that actually, if you would think about it, in 1991 there was a report published by the American military that a small group of people, a small army, would be able to overthrow a government with the support of mass media and something they in 1991 called international radio system of interconnected people, which we may assume was supposed to become internet. Now imagine 1991, we not only didn't know what internet was, most of us even didn't have mobile phones at the time, not even Facebook, mass media. And now we have these huge structures of Facebook, social media, television, and where they can massively control people's opinions on political situations. And we can see this occurrence happening before in Libya, in Yugoslavia, where the real people in Europe do not really know what is going on. They do not know the truth, because the truth is presented and shoveled into their heads the way it is needed for those who are at power at this moment.
Okay, and so how do you understand the Maidan's uprising?
Maidan uprising is a consequence of many years of work. It didn't happen just in one day. The work of Maidan was prepared for many years, maybe 20 years or more.
The continuation of the Orange Revolution?
Yes, there was an Orange Revolution several years ago, and even the Orange Revolution didn't happen just like that. It was prepared for many years before. So it is a continuation, and you must also realize that those who came to power in Ukraine, in Kiev, after Maidan, they're not new people.
Yeah, so this is a very important point. So the government that is presented as a new government, you point out that it's not new.
Nobody is new. It started as regular people who would stand up against corruption of the old government. And let us not make a mistake, the old government was very corrupt and the people were poor. But you, as a normal person who has work, you cannot stand on the barricades for weeks, you cannot keep fighting, you must have money to eat. So what happened later on is that extremist groups took over the people's stride and took over governmental positions, and someone was paying the extremist groups, because unless you're paid, you will not stand there for weeks. And those who got installed with the help of extremist nationalist groups were no ones from the streets. They were people who were running the central bank for many years. They were former ministers, they were former secretaries of the government, party leaders and parliamentary leaders. Even more, if you look at the current parliament of Ukraine, there's over 300 millionaires and billionaires inside the parliament of a very poor government. How can there be so many millionaires and billionaires?
Yeah, no European countries.
How many European countries have so many millionaires and billionaires in one parliament?
So what you're saying is that it's the same oligarchs as before, plus new people that could we call them fascists, or you think it's too much? How do they name themselves?
You have to realize the structure of fascism or nationalism. There are extremist nationalist groups. They are small, but they are very exercised in fighting street fights. Around them, there are hundreds of supporters. There's people who give money or support or buildings to those people. They are less extreme, but they show support. And there's sympathizers. There's thousands of people. You do not need to throw a Molotov cocktail. It is enough for fascism to strive if you are just turning away and accepting what they do. And that's thousands of people. Now, people on top of the government, people like Jarosz and Ternebok, they are factual leaders of extremist groups, of national groups.
Svoboda?
And Svoboda, it consists more of supporters. They are not directly quoting Mein Kampf like extremist groups. They do not have tattoos with 88 on their necks, but they give financial support for this. They give direct or indirect financial support to these nationalist groups. And even more, Svoboda and parties from Tymoshenko and others, they are the ones who are giving a niche for the nationalists to strive. For example, they would disallow the Russian language. They would teach in schools the ideas that Bandera, who was...
explain to the audience who is Bandera.
Bandera. When Hitler took over Ukraine, you can compare it with in France, like I would think with the Vichy government.
Yes.
Yes, they needed someone to rule the state. But what happened is that Ukraine was part of Soviet Union and there was a people's conscience of one nation. And they needed an ideology to separate the two nations apart. So Goebbels and Bandera introduced an idea of Ukrainian nationalism. And this Ukrainian nationalism was worked on for several years. And Bandera was the leader of Ukrainian nationalism and leader of Ukrainian insurgency army. What's most important to realize is that the fascist work that was sometimes even too dirty for the Germans was ordered to Ukrainians to execute. Not only Russians were killed, Jews were killed. Southern Poland was cleansed. They would burn villages. They would send terrorist missions to terrorize local communities. Slovak nations were killed. Gypsies were killed. All by this insurgency army. And Bandera was its leader. There's many pictures on Google. You can see Bandera in Nazi uniform. So all those who claim that Bandera was just leader of Ukraine, well, you wouldn't wear Nazi uniform under Hitler and be just neutral, wouldn't you?
Sure.
And those ideas are now presented by the new government for the last 20 years as Bandera was a good guy, because they need some ideology to separate themselves. And that's what Svoboda has been doing for many years.
Okay. And so this is new, not new, but this government, how does it act towards the East? And what is the military situation in the East?
The military situation is twofold. First of all, you have to realize that there are simple people, simple working men, regular people from these districts who have taken arms to protect their own houses. Because those people did not want to accept the central government. And how to say, the central government has formed its own army. But one of the conditions of Geneva Conventions is that they had to remove nationalist groups. So what they did is they took all the nationalist groups and they placed them into the regular army, and they called it National Guard. The National Guard consists of extremist groups and of regularly drafted men. Some regularly drafted men are forced to be in the army because there was a law that you have to enlist to protect motherland, otherwise you would go to prison for 4 years.
So the Ukrainian of the West, Ukrainian people of the West, must go to the army if they don't want to be put in jail. But
yes.
And they are told a lot of things. They are maybe brainwashed into thinking that in front of them there will be Russian, because they think they are going in war with Russia.
Yes, that is true, because as we go back to the concept of information warfare, the information stream is very hard. If you look at the Ukrainian television, there's a number of channels day and night showing how terrible Russians are killing hundreds of poor Ukrainian people. There's Russian terrorists on the streets forcing Ukrainians to do everything. So the people went to the army with the thoughts that they would protect their country, their nation. And what happened? First, they had to sit for several months in the army. They were not paid or even fed. Many of them were in very poor condition. In the end, they were brought to the cities in the east. And what did they see? They see regular men in their own villages coming outside and asking, "What are you doing here? Why are you here to kill me?" So the information warfare is very different. They thought one thing, but they drove into villages, and your own people, you must shoot at your own people. It's very strange for them. And the second thing is they were not fed or properly commanded for several months. And then you see these people with food coming out of houses and offering to them. There were actually a number of defections just because, well, they were getting food. That's how it is.
But as you explain this, it seems that the central government of Ukraine has less authorities, has very few authority.
Yes, this is a consequence of a number of things, actually. Mostly two things. First of all, the central government, which supported ideas of Goebbels, disallowed Russian culture and language.
Okay.
You must realize that in the east of Ukraine, the majority speaks only Russian. They know Ukrainian, but they consider their culture to be Russian. So it may look unimportantly, but on an official level, you cannot do anything without Russian language. If you talk to a policeman, you must talk to him in Ukrainian. If you go to university, you must write the test in Ukrainian. If you go to a theater, we went to Spartacus, the program is only in Ukrainian. So you can imagine that the majority of the people lost their ability. You can't even vote because the voting billet is in Ukrainian only. So you lost your ability for political participation. The second part is that several crucial Russian cultural elements have been forbidden. For example, the Victory Day of the Second World War.
Oh, this is very important.
This has been forbidden.
By who?
By the central government.
Okay.
You might imagine that most East Russians and Ukrainians have families who fought either in partisan warfare or in regular Soviet forces. Many died, and it is the part of their own identity, of who they are, as feeling a victor in the Second World War. You can imagine as for French with Charles de Gaulle, it would be the same as Charles de Gaulle would be vilified.
Yeah.
And by taking away 9 May, one of the most important days, it would be the same for Europe as you would take away Christmas. Now, how would you
8
feel?
May.
Or 8 May. Now they turned it into a day of suffering and losses instead of Victory Day. And if you celebrate 9 May, you are considered extremist.
Yeah.
And the third most important for people in East Ukraine is that most people realize that there's no one new. The same criminals came to power, and now they're only going to be more poor. This is the third factor.
Okay, so, and do you think that in the East, people are only against this government because it's a nationalist government, or they're also against the oligarchs?
Now, this is a very interesting question, because this brings us to the question of oligarchy in Ukraine. There are a number of oligarchs who own almost everything in the country. In East Ukraine, the oligarch was Akhmetov. Mm-hmm. He owned 80% of all the property in the region.
80%, so almost, yeah, almost a monopoly.
Almost a monopoly, state monopoly, or oligarchy monopoly on property. You go to a restaurant, you eat in Akhmetov's restaurant. You go to a shopping center, you buy Akhmetov's stuff. You rent a house, it belongs to Akhmetov. You work in a mine shaft, and the profit goes to Akhmetov. And now what happens is that because of this, there was almost no small scale businesses. Mm-hmm. Almost all were working from one guy. Almost all were workers, because there are cities with tens of thousands of mine workers underground. And not all mines are profitable in our days. Gas is much cheaper. So what happened is that Akhmetov had a kind of circulation. He would take money from profiting industry and he would place it into a losing industry. And he kept it around. And there was a kind of struggle. There was a chance that Kiev wanted part of his property. So Akhmetov was silent for many days. And
so at the beginning he didn't take a stance between...
He didn't take a stance, he was in the background.
He was on the background?
Until 2 days back, where he was against Eastern Ukraine. He said, we should unite with Kiev. He
supported the government?
He probably made a financial deal, because that's how you do it. And now the first question was to nationalize all the property.
Okay, so what you are saying is that at the moment where Akhmetov, the oligarch, took stance for the Ukraine government, then people started thinking about nationalizing his properties?
Regular people in the street were saying that before.
Yes.
I would say that there is a very high class consciousness in East Ukraine, because most are simple workers, real working men, and as I would say, there was no small businesses. And also, how can I explain it? People were very rich in the times of Soviet Union, the working men, in comparison to what they are now.
Richer than, okay.
They would have wages of 800 rubles for working underground, in comparison to a man who would work on a regular job, which was 150 rubles. And with 800 rubles you could buy anything at the time. People remember those times very well. So people on the front line, they want to go back to the Soviet Union. The idea of Soviet socialist idea. And this brings us to another interesting question, is that situation in East Ukraine now resembles a lot Spanish Civil War.
Could you develop the analogy?
The analogy is that there's a lot of ideas of socialism and leftist development of the region. There's a very high class conscience. It's one of the unique regions remaining in Europe which has a high class conscience at this time. People are not yet corrupted by private property, and at the same time they have memories of Soviet socialist ideas. And a lot of socially oriented people go to the region to help those people.
But is there a left-wing or socialist party that is organized in this area or not? Or just it comes from people?
There is a movement by Pavel Gubarev, which is called National People's Front. People were very rich in the times of Soviet Union, the working men, in comparison to what they are now.
Richer than okay.
They would have wages of 800 rubles for working underground, in comparison to a man who would work on a regular job, which was 150 rubles. And with 800 rubles you could buy anything at the time. People remember those times very well. So people on the front line, they want to go back to the Soviet Union. The idea of Soviet socialist idea. And this brings us to another interesting question, is that situation in East Ukraine now resembles a lot Spanish Civil War.
Could you develop the analogy?
The analogy is that there's a lot of ideas of socialism and leftist development of the region.
Tell us about this de facto authorities of the east of Ukraine.
The authorities are very interesting, actually, because they are considering to build a presidium of leaders. They have specialists in economics, in law, whatever, and it's people who rose up in times of crisis, who were not afraid to stand up. Even if they lose, they basically will be killed or imprisoned. But it's that group which rose up. And I've met leadership, and you can see that they can read and talk to you and answer the telephone and do things.
Left-wing people?
Mostly left-wing. I cannot speak for all. I haven't met all. Yet after the occurrence with Akhmetov and the answer that they plan to nationalize his property and oligarchic property, well, we can judge by the acts, not by the words. We will see it later on. And
would you go to describe these new authorities as pro-Putin, or you think that they don't position themselves in this kind of thinking? They are just wanting to nationalize and...
Well, you have to think about the situation that at this moment it is a truly people's government. The people, regional people, have a lot of influence on the leaders. Basically, even if the leader wouldn't want something or would want something that would Putin want, imagine he would be Putin's supporter. If the regular people on the barricade want something else, they actually have a lot of chances to replace him.
Okay.
So at this moment, they are pressured by the people. So you must realize what the whole community wants there. And the community wants independence from oligarchy.
So they are not interested into becoming a new oligarchy, a pro-Putin oligarchy?
They are not interested in becoming pro-Putin oligarchy. They do not want nationalist influence from Kiev. But the problem is, it brings us to a number of practical questions. Something that we have never thought about. For example, if you seize power, then the banking system. What happens next? Back in the 20th century, the gold was in the banks. Now all the money is electronic. So what do? Kiev, the central government, only needs to click with one button and the banking system is off. You cannot do payments. People cannot get wages. Old people, invalids, cannot get money to eat. And people need to eat today. The region can be profitable in a year or two. But what do you do in this time in between. You even can't print money as fast. So the only alternative would be either to switch over to Russian Putin's banking system or to introduce food stamps. There will still be a kind of dependence with Russia. This is the whole geopolitical sphere. You can't be totally independent in our days. You're either dependent from dollar-eurozone or you're dependent from the Eastern zone. And as these people are part of the Russian culture and influence, it's logically that they will look for alliances in economic or power alliances with Russia. Basically, they have no other choice. It's something we have to consider.
But could, in your opinion, could Russia accept that the authorities of east of Ukraine implement a socialist policy? Or would...
We have example of Belarus.
Yeah.
In Belarus, a lot of production is either nationalized or by a strong governmental control. Now there's a strong leader who keeps it all together, but it is accepted by Russia.
So Russia, in fact, doesn't interfere with the economic policy of the countries that depends, or interfere less than what Europe will do? Could we say that? Or?
Russia interferes. Everyone interferes. If not one, then another one interferes. It's a logical geopolitical situation. No one is independent.
Do you put their ingerence at the same level? Or?
The thing is that Russia has more ability to build peace and statehood in the region. If we look at the Western state building, the West has no state building mechanisms. They bombed Iraq or Yugoslavia, Libya, and look what happens there. For decades, there's no statehood. There's no order. There's groups of people killing each other. And Russia, in comparison, has 180 nations just inside the Russian Federation. It has a tradition and culture which is understandable with Ukraine. You could consider the fact that this former Soviet Union, and Russia being successor of the Soviet Union, is inside Russian influence zone. So it is much easier for Russia to build peace and prosperity within the region. In any case, to find a common language.
Okay. And how could people from left parties and left movements in Europe support what is happening, to support these people in the east of Ukraine?
The most important is to find a way how to break through the information blockade. As you see, the media is massively pressing basically what they want to see. I do not know how scientific it is to bring news which even hasn't been controlled, but I have the idea that they show what they want to show, not what is really going on. And I can imagine that in Europe there are a lot of people who are honest, who do not want to accept this, how you call, intelligence failure, and yet they are pushed in it by the total media. So if we start showing an alternative point of view on this situation,
as we do today,
the more people there are, the more people talk about it, the better it will be. And the second thing is that actually Europe should stop financing the central government in Kiev. Basically, it is a bottomless pit. They are all corrupt, all one by one, so the money will either go into their pockets or into the military, which will be used to kill more civilians.
Are there a lot of civilians that are killed by the central government?
This is an interesting another idea, and this is a point by itself, is that in East Ukraine, what we have seen, is a real civil war. The central government, which formed its National Guard, is fighting against people who basically defend their homes. You see people on the barricades wearing swords, wearing hatchets, anything they can arm themselves with is what they use to protect themselves. I saw a guy with a pirate pistol, one of those things you put a bullet inside and then you shoot once in 5 minutes. But he feels more safe with such a pirate pistol.
Do they receive weapons from foreign countries like for Russia, or do they arm themselves?
I didn't see massive arming of people. Most people arm themselves. Maybe they arm themselves somehow on the front line. They overtook a number of military stations, and the police has now become loyal to the new government. So it is logical that they have professional arms themselves. Also, a number of Ukrainian regular troops have defected to the side of the people.
Oh, so it's important.
They have sniper rifles. They have that on the front line, and they have enough to hold their ground. Yet, people in the cities, what there was called national defense, civil defense. Now you must understand that civil war of the 21st century, it looks entirely different as than we are used in the movies. Civil war of 21st century is that people enrolled themselves in the army, and they go around their work. They go with their children, and they received a rifle, and once the enemy army moves into your city, this is when they shoot basically from the windows of their homes. This is what a real civil war looks like. And you see guys on the barricades protecting the buildings, and then their wives coming around bringing them food. You see sometimes the guys go home for an hour to sleep, and then the wives stand with the rifle protecting the barricade.
And everything is on Facebook or on Twitter?
They coordinate each other on Twitter and Facebook. I had an 80-year-old guy, who came over to me and asked me for our Facebook group. It is very unusual to see how modern technology and civil warfare are intertwined into this modern day technology, into this modern day war. The weapons have made the front line much further apart. People are 3, maybe 5 kilometers apart from each other, shooting at each other, because they're snipers, they're rockets, they're hand rockets. So there's no more charge into the bullets as it used to be in the First World War and the Second World War. You almost don't see your enemies unless it's a sniper. You see some people shooting somewhere through the woods, then there's some fire back from much distance, then you shoot some grenades, and basically that's it. So it's like on the front line in Slaviansk and Kramatorsk, a very small group of people is holding the line against, I believe, 15,000 Ukrainian troops. Now they're able to do this because it's in front of mountain pass. They dug themselves in, and they're sitting there and shooting back. And nobody wants to die. So nobody charges, especially in the Ukrainian Central Army, where part of the people are forced to fight, and the nationalists, well, you don't want to die, you want to see the results of your work. So nobody wants to charge blindly those people who are protecting themselves.
Even the far-right extremists?
Sometimes you must also realize the other aspect of the civil war of our days is that there are no static positions. The military groups are in a constant movement around each other. It's useless to sit on a front post and wait until a rocket hits you. So when you see 5 kilometers from front that the enemy is coming at you, you just move away. And then if the enemy will never sit at that barricade as well. Sometimes there's news that central Ukrainian government has entered the city. Yes, they do enter the city for 15 minutes and in tanks, and then they move out. Because if you sit longer, you either get a grenade or a sniper shooting at you. So nobody sits on a certain place.
And are there some blockades against the cities made by the central government?
Well, for example, I talked to the main doctor of Donetsk, who is organizing medicine and hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, Slaviansk is a city in siege. You, in order to get into the city, you must go through 3 levels of blockades from all sides. What it means is that you are not allowed to bring in any cargo. The biggest problem is a humanitarian catastrophe, because they are not allowed to bring any medicines into the city.
Okay.
There is a large shortage of insulin.
Insulin?
There's even people already laying in coma
Diabetic
because
people?
of
Because they don't
no insulin.
They have no insulin.
And other things as well. You can imagine that many people are in higher age, 50, 60-year-old, protecting their houses. They're very nervous, and so they have high blood pressure. And they have a large shortage on medicine for that. If you're used to a regular warfare where you just need morphine and bandages and you're all right, in a civil war you need things for elderly, you need things for newly born children. They don't have Pampers, very simple like that. They don't have alcohol to clean their wounds. And how would you what legitimate government would consider besieging a city and not even allowing medicine into the city in Kiev? How do people feel towards such a government? Another thing is that the government, the cities are surrounded with Grad installations. A Grad installation is a modern-day Katyusha, if you know from the Second World War. Only it shoots much further and it has much larger reach. It shoots indiscriminately.
Civilian.
It destroys a large level, and a large number of these Grads is already around the city. If you are to bring peace to the city, why do you take Grad at all? Because you cannot shoot a single target in a city. You level the whole neighborhood.
Is it allowed by international law?
I'm not sure.
No?
I'm not sure. Maybe they are. But if this, as the central government in Kiev claims, is an
terrorist
peaceful mission, why would you bring these weapons at all? Unless you want to terrorize the local population.
And do you think that this government, this central government, has a chance to re-establish its authority in Ukraine or not? In the current situation?
In the current situation, as the most people in Ukraine say, the point of no return has been reached. Because there were people burned alive in Odessa. Several hundred of people were brought into a house and they were shot at if they wanted to escape the house.
Who did that?
By right-wing extremists.
Okay. Right-wing extremists that were part of the National Guard? Or?
No, they were just like presented as football hooligans.
Okay.
Yet at the same time, we all know that many oligarchs pay for those football hooligans who are at the same time right-wing extremists. Because in a civil war, last thing that interests you is football. It is a cover-up for right-wing extremists. Imagine yourself, if your family is on the front line, would you really go watch, bash someone's head in because he wears a different
It's very important. So you claim that in addition to the National Guard and army, there is a kind of paramilitary force that is presented as football hooligans, but that is in fact financed by oligarchs in support of the Kiev's government. Would you say that?
You would say two things. First of all, the central government has gone too far with state violence, with mass murderers. The killing is systematic and purposeful. in Odessa, and then on 9 May in Mariupol. 9 May, the Victory Day, was disallowed. People went to celebrate it, and the National Guard shot at tens of people and killed them. So the government lost its legitimacy in that. The second of all is that there is no longer a state monopoly on violence. Because
Could you explain us?
I will explain you this. Several groups are controlled by different leaders. There are a small army of current presidential candidates. Different candidates have different control over different armies. Then there are oligarchs. They have their own armies. And also, if you look at the footages of the front line, some tanks are supported by little green buses. A normal person wouldn't notice this, but it are little green buses which are owned by Privatbank, which is owned by Kolomoisky. This would be the same as the French bank BNP would send its wagons to somewhere to Africa on a peace mission. Would that be considered legitimately, or what would you think about participation of the bank in the civil war? So there's no state control on violence anymore. And there are, you ask the question if Ukraine can continue within its former existence. It doesn't effectively control its own territory anymore.
You mean even the West?
The West they might control, the East they do not control, and several cities there are uprisings which are being held by strong force. This is only a matter of time, because you cannot hold a city which is against you. You can hold it for a month, for 2 months. First of all, it's very expensive. Second of all, in the end,
There are East cities, are also cities in the West that want to uprise against the
there are cities in the West as well. First of all, there are cities in the south, like Odessa. The second of all, there are cities completely in the West, which are based by Russian minorities called Rusins. They also formed or trying to form their own government. So you can see that the territory is slowly falling apart. The third argument is that the state no longer has its own budget. It is completely dependent of foreign investments, foreign credits. European Union, WTO, IMF, all those who give them money.
And do they give the money, or do they ask reforms in exchange of the money?
They ask reforms as well.
What kind of reform?
They ask to lower import taxes, they ask to destroy the social state, they ask, well, you can imagine that the mine shafts will close down and the factories will close down because they're competition to Western production. But this is not even as important at this moment, because any money which goes into the budget is being spent either on the military or disappears in corrupt pockets. Because in fact you have to change more than 500 people in the government of Ukraine. Changing 2 or 3 heads will not do anything. The second in command will come to power. And nobody is planning to change 500 people in the government. Now, but the most important question is there is no own budget. This is one of the reasons that you can consider Ukraine as a non-existing state anymore. And the final is that the people have no perspective for progressive development in the future. None at all. In some states torn by war, there's still perspective after peace that it will develop further. The only thing that Ukrainians or people of East Ukraine new republics see is that if they join Ukraine, even if the nationalists go away, is that they will be more poor for many years in front, and the development will stop. So what is the reason for them to continue their existence within the current form?
And so, do you think that it is possible to have a presidential election in this context, or is it totally nonsense?
This is a very strange question because it is somehow, without participation of large regions, predetermined that there will be two candidates, both who are very corrupt, and that one will win, most probably Poroshenko.
So the election is already written.
It is very strange, but it is very written, without participation of large amount of people and without acceptance of the central government. The central government no longer has authority, even among the police, even among the military.
Why?
Because either police and military moved over to the new governments in the other republics of East Ukraine, new formed republics, or simply because you cannot survive on a very small wages. So, and basically people are not stupid. You must realize that Ukraine used to be a highly developed state, especially in times of Soviet Union. The culture and the technical scientific development was very high. They were building rockets. That's one of the most highest developed countries. So the culture and the moral development of the people was very high. If you look, for example, at Africa, and no offense to Africa, but people have this tribal thinking ideas. My tribe, my family, they are on a, often, not all, on a lower sociological, I wouldn't say lower, on a different sociological level of thinking, on my village thinking. Ukrainians have been highly developed for many years, even the police. So if you see a new government which is highly corrupt, which is highly immoral, giving you orders, then as a human being who has been culturally very highly educated, you don't accept their rule.
But this you mean in the east of Ukraine? But you also think that in the west of Ukraine there could be a new uprising against...
Most probably it could be as well in the West Ukraine. When they stop getting wages, there will be an uprising in the West. And a lot of people, they are not very political, but for them it's important to feed their families, as in the whole world. Once you can't feed your family, the only choice that remains is either to immigrate or to have an uprising. And what we see now a lot is this liberal idea of depolitization. In a socially interested states, in socially developed states where social ideas, leftist ideas are strong, the main purpose is to politicize people. Because you can't live in society and be independent of that society. So when a person realizes how the geopolitical situation works, how the banks exploit the people, he will never vote for liberals, especially a simple working man. As you see in the West now, how many percent will go to the Western, to the European elections? I don't know, how many do you think?
40.
40?
At best.
At best, right? And it's elections. Normally everyone should go to vote. And yet liberal politicians are interested in depoliticizing people. Because what happens is that either the really interested liberals go to vote and they get higher quota, or people don't know what's going on and they don't care, and they are able to push in through their policies. So as long as you're busy with your questions of non-politics and questions of what color of shoes Britney Spears has, instead of questions why the bank exploits or how the bank exploits the working man, it's good for the current politicians.
And also it seems that people, at least in the west of Ukraine, want to join the European Union. But would you say that the European Union makes a good policy on Ukraine, or is trying to make peace with Ukraine, or on the contrary, that European Union has a bad policy supporting the civil war in Ukraine?
What we see now is, I believe, that 3 billion have been provided to the central government. It's money from taxpayers in in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That money goes to a corrupt source.
Yeah.
It will never serve peace as a base for National Guard. So you can decide for yourself if it's a good or a bad policy. The second question is that it has been for many years idea to separate Ukraine from Russia in the Europe.
So there is a geopolitical project. Do you think it's all countries of Europe or some countries of Europe have the project to separate Ukraine from Russia?
I think it's a first step.
Mm-hmm.
Because, well, you look at Ukraine, it's not really rich, there's not really many resources there, there's coal underground,
mm-hmm.
but it's not really profitable. You can make it profitable if it's a self-sustaining region, but it's only profitable for that region only. The farmlands are not interesting for Europe because Europe has its own farmlands and they don't need the competition. We have the example from Africa where we don't allow food from Africa into Europe, which is much cheaper. So why would they go into Ukraine? They don't need the extra labor forces because they have enough from Bulgaria, Romania, other states which are maybe just as poor, or I don't know exactly how much poorer they are. So the next step is the idea which was repeated several times by Kiev and by Europe is the building of NATO bases in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
From an objective point of view, why would you build NATO bases in Ukraine? If Russia before was considered a partner, why? If it's against Iran, you have bases in Turkey.
No, it's directed against.
It is directed against Russia. So it's basically it is a next step and the closest border to Russia.
But yeah, what you described seems to be a U.S. Agenda against Russia. But would you say that European Union has exactly the same agenda as USA, or they have their own interest in the crisis?
I wouldn't say that European Union has exact interest, direct interest in exactly the same interest in the crisis. Yet euro and dollar are connected. You know that. We know that all the international oil or resources are sold in dollars, and the dollars are printed from air. They need $1 billion, they create American debt, widen it, they have $1 billion, they can buy more resources in dollars. So they get the resources in dollars for free. Europe participates in the whole market, and European and American markets are very interconnected. Now, of course, Europe has national interests. For example, you can see large opposition in Germany. Germany has a large opposition against the war in Ukraine, just because, well, they don't want to lose money on the war. And from a very dry financial point of view, the most profitable for Europe was to let Russia rule Ukraine. Let's just say very bluntly. Because Russia would accept losing regions, Russia would lose in finance, Europe would stay rich, it would continue its financial ties with Russia, continue its cheap gas, everybody wins. So it brings us to political agendas. What is the bigger victory for Europe if they are able to build NATO bases in East Ukraine? And the bigger victory is Russia itself. As we mentioned before, we have a very developed information warfare in which you can overthrow any government. And second of all, we have an international banking system with which you can manipulate other courses. And we have a multicultural Russia with more than 180 nations inside Russia. You will always find someone who would want to be a separatist or a separate ruler. So the next step is the division of Russia. And the road to Russia is Ukraine.
But once again, is it the interest of Europe to destroy Russia, or is it only an implementation
It's not
of
destroy,
the US agenda?
divide.
Divide.
Why?
Is it the European interest or not?
Perhaps liberal European, perhaps. On the long term, Russia has largest resources in the world. Basically, it is the richest country. Oil, gas, whatever. And the resources are running out. What happens when the resources start running out? Those who have them dictate the policy. It is a desperate attempt to overtake the final resources. After that, if Russia is divided, you know, I've always been interested in the idea that Europe looked at non-Europeans or at people who are further away from Europe as at some kind of second-rate citizens. I think it's a continuation of colonial thinking. We have
you
to
mean the
educate
European
them.
elites, or even
The West European states. It's like
oligarchs?
yes, probably. What you see is that the less country resembles West Europe, the more bad it is portrayed in the West. I wonder why, because there are different cultures and every state is right to its own culture. But I haven't received an answer to a question why some people in the West feel that they have the right to tell other states how they should live. I have asked many journalists this question. I received answers about democracy, about freedom of speech, about whatever. But in the end, what is it to you? All right, freedom of speech, democracy, which is a subjective term. Democracy for one, freedom for one, is non-freedom for another. And then, who are you in your country to tell to another culture how to live?
But I think the question you raise is very interesting, but do you think that the European governments truly believe that they are implementing what they perceive as democratic or human rights norms for the rest of the world?
I think,
or are they hypocrites? Because, for example, they care very much about human rights in Russia, but we never hear them talking about human rights in Saudi Arabia. So maybe it's an hypothesis, but maybe it's just as when a government goes against their interests, then they point out their weakness.
I think that the policy of double standards is very old. The policy of double standards, they use the same diplomatic means, the same diplomatic tools, only for their interest. What is interesting for them is good. What is not interesting in their financial interests is bad. Human rights is a tool in law. As many lawyers, we joke that all rights in the law are human rights, unless they're animal rights. Because, that's how it is. What's the purpose of freedom of speech if you're hungry and you haven't had an education? It is a very subjective understanding. And these rights, they're part of social contract.
Well, it's not necessarily subjective. I mean, you could argue that there are human rights which include the social rights.
Yes.
I mean, the whole debate to know are human rights only the right of the individuals, the former liberal rights, are there also social rights that must include in that?
It is true, it is a good question. I think it's a part of social contract. Some rights are inherently will be in any society. The question which brings us back is the geopolitical situation. and double standards.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the question of double standards. I mean, could we, or could you state that, do you think that the European governments are always blaming the situation of human rights in Russia because they have an interest to destabilize Russia? Or are they very are they honest when they say that they really care about human rights in Russia? Do they really care?
I think there are two types of politicians in the West.
Yeah.
The first ones who see financial direct profit, and they don't. As there's a joke, there's no crime for which the capital wouldn't commit if it has its own profit. The second politicians are just people who are cheated
by the media warfare.
By the media warfare. And you can imagine that the current scientific institutions have built a whole system of specialists who think within the categories of West Europe, which is basically democracy of the West, which is good, against anything else, which is different. So when such a person finds himself in a different situation, he looks through his own filters, through the pre-taught filters at the universities. They do not look at society through the question of property. To whom does the property go? Because in the end, those who pay, they dictate the music.
Yeah. So it's a very important question. So class consciousness.
Class consciousness is not taught in the West.
Yeah.
Yet what we are taught is dictatorship against democracy, which is a basic liberal concept. The more government has control over the market, the more dictatorship it is considered.
By liberal standards.
By liberal standards. They ignore any ideas of property, of this dictatorship over the property, but they do place it as dictatorship against the subjective term freedom. So then anyone who doesn't allow national privatization, or anyone who keeps strong control on the mass property is a dictator
Latin America,
who doesn't allow human rights, as they say. And this brings us back to the big geopolitical question. Some governments are forced to reduce some human rights, like freedom of speech, because of the strong information warfare.
Do you have examples in mind?
For example, Belarus. If you allow the Western media to be very strong in that state, and the West has much more money than Belarus by itself, then you will have the same situation as in Ukraine.
But don't you think there's an intermediary between, in Belarus, the state and the censorship controls everything, and on the other hand, having to accept all the propaganda from the West? For example, I think I was thinking about the situation in Venezuela, was there was the creation of local media.
Situation in Venezuela. We were busy with the situation in Venezuela. Our group has been providing assistance in the information warfare to Venezuelans during the previous elections, to the President Maduro, the future to be President Maduro. They won by 200,000 votes difference, which is a minimal difference.
But it's also a thing of democracy. It's the thing that...
And this brings us back to the question of democracy, which is subjective. What would happen if his opponent Capriles would have won just because he was a more skilled information warrior? The oil would be privatized, the people would lose a lot more, the whole work of Chavez of last 10 years would have been destroyed, and America would install a puppet government in Venezuela. Now, would you consider the whole subject of human rights and democracy in Venezuela as loose if all this is at risk. Imagine if that would happen completely. And this is Venezuela. We're talking, we can lose it any moment. So all the work we did for 20 years can be lost just like that. Especially now that the resources are running out. They're getting more desperate. So this concept of human rights is an interesting concept in the West.
But on the other hand, you could argue that if the government had to limit the freedom of press and for example, to forbidden the opposition, because we know that it's a right-wing opposition supported by the USF. Maybe if the government did that, then it would lose some legitimacy because it takes all these risks. But on the other hand, it is worth it because it gives them some legitimacy for the people and some legitimacy that, for example, you mentioned the experience of the Soviet Union. It seems that in the Soviet Union, at some point, the people did not support at all the government.
The question of legitimacy we can see like this. Maduro won, and yet half a year later, the opposition, which wasn't disallowed, attempted a coup. So the legitimacy for those who are in the West is the last question they are interested in.
Sure, but for Maduro and for his supporters?
For Maduro and his supporters, they barely won, and I hope they will stay in power for long times. And yet, as you can see, this legitimacy is more towards the West. And what? The West doesn't care about it, because they attempt a coup.
It's towards its own people.
And they tried a part of the people to install a coup. What does it mean? We can turn Venezuela into an Iraq. Would it be better for the people? Probably not. But it would be better for the West. Or into Libya now. We get very cheap oil from Libya. The people in Libya were living very, very rich for African standards. They would be getting around 1,000 euros wages. They had free health care. They had free rent. You could get a state credit to buy a new car. And they actually could buy anything they wanted. And this government got overthrown. What does it mean?
But
how do they live now?
But don't you think that it was possible to overthrow it because it had lost its legitimacy, not towards the West but towards its own people, and it precisely had lost any legitimacy towards its own people because it never implemented democratic reforms. So democratic reforms will not be something to please the West, but to please its own people.
The fun thing about it is that the majority of people in the world do not live by Western democratic reforms.
What do you mean?
The Chinese, the Indians.
Yeah, but maybe it's no, Indians they do, but
the majority, the Africans.
There are elections in India.
There's a lot of people who do not live by it, and
no. But my question is: do you think that implementing a democratic, but even we could say politically liberal agenda, just let apart the social question, but just making freedom of press, freedom of speech, multi-party elections, do you think it's only a matter of going into Western standards, or don't you think that it is also a way for a government to get and to win legitimacy towards its own people, and maybe to survive longer than the previous socialist experience have lasted?
I understand the question. The thing is that...
Or you could disagree if you want.
The idea, this is how it is presented in the West. Yet, if we see that that politics, democracy, human rights, whatever, liberalism, any political ideology, it is a superstructure which is based on economical base, economy. So, economy dictates politics. Property and whom it belongs to always dictates politics. So democracy is, as a subjective term, is dependent of economy, of property. Now you can talk as much as you want about legitimacy and democracy. In the end, property dictates. For the West, as long as it doesn't have the property, it will never consider the government legitimate or democratic.
Sure, by capitalist standards.
But it will always be in the Western warfare, information warfare, presented as undemocratic. But yet, as we know, most Latin American countries are more democratic than United States.
Yeah.
Yet, United States is the beacon of democracy and freedom.
Is what?
It is the example of democracy and freedom.
Right, it's given by the US themselves.
And information warfare.
Yeah, in the information warfare.
So it doesn't matter what kind of democracy or freedom you build, as long as the West doesn't have control over the property, it will never accept.
Yeah,
and
for
yet,
sure,
if it does have control over the property, like we go back to your question of Saudi Arabia, then it becomes a democratic state.
Yeah.
So you have to see the picture from a bigger perspective.
I think this we
superstructure.
We totally agree on this, but
and just talking about democracy and freedom or whatever in the picture of ignoring the property, you can install all kinds of instruments, but in the end, it comes down to property. So that's
okay. And so maybe a last question. So, what, in your opinion, could people who are supporting peace in Ukraine and who are supporting the people in the east of Ukraine, what could we do, for example, in the information plan, or maybe could we? Do you think it's possible to launch a European movement of solidarity with people of Ukraine?
First of all, we can learn a lot from this because, as I said, the current East Ukrainian situation resembles a lot the Spanish Civil War. And we have learned a lot as leftists from Spanish Civil War. We had the best writers after that. We had the best poets. We had Picasso. We had Hemingway. We had leaders of European socialist parties who fought in the Spanish Civil War, in the internationalist brigades. So the most important is to take the lesson, and the main lesson
so is we should go there?
We shouldn't go there. What's the point? If you cannot shoot, what can you do? The most important lesson at these days is to learn how to fight in the information warfare. We should create a strong umbrella of information media which is able to provide an alternative view on situations worldwide from a socialist, from a leftist perspective. This way, if we have our people in the front line and they bring us news, we can already spread it through socially conscious people in Europe. If we have this class in Europe, first of all, we will start winning elections here because we can provide truthful information. Second of all, we can start working on the geopolitical situation. We can move it towards socialism. And this is very important to take lessons from this. People in Europe, socially interested people, should find ways to unite for a common goal. And should, of course, if they want to help East Ukraine, they should find information to spread it amongst each other. Because as experience of Spanish Civil War has shown, those in the Spanish Civil War who were there together, they later got shown themselves that they were able to change the world. So if you look among your friends with common ideas on Ukrainian situation, it is those people on whom you can rely in the future. And that is a very interesting idea to think about.
Okay. So maybe as a conclusion, so you can say that there is a European movement in solidarity with Ukraine that is led mostly by the parties of United Left, in France, Left Front, in Germany, Die Linke, and so on. And we hope to make a large movement in the society to help and to help the European understanding that what they believe to be the freedom of press today, as it was said, in fact, it's just the freedom of oligarchs. We have our own oligarchs. Our medias complain against Ukrainian oligarchs, but we have also the French oligarchs who control the French media, and maybe one day we will overthrow them.
I'm Alexander Lipen. I'm an international lawyer, and I have been in Ukraine as a journalist from the 2nd of May until the referendum, which was held 10 days later, on the 11th.
Donc Alexandre Ayer, avocat international et journaliste qui s'est rendu en Ukraine pendant 11 jours, juste avant le référendum à Donetsk et en partie juste après.
And for me, it was very interesting to see what it is really like, the situation on the ground, how a civil war really looks like in the modern day.
C'était vraiment intéressant de voir sur le terrain qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une guerre civile aujourd'hui à notre époque.
And the second question is how a referendum of independence of a certain state can be held. It's a purely scientific interest.
Et d'un niveau scientifique, c'est intéressant de voir comment un référendum d'indépendance peut être mené dans un pays.
So the first question is the civil war. It was very surprising, and it was completely something that I did not expect.
Donc il ne s'attendait pas du tout à voir que la guerre civile aujourd'hui ressemblait à ça.
You might have seen the war in the movies or computer games,
Ce qu'on a vu dans les films ou dans les jeux vidéo.
where people look at each other and they shoot each other and there's chaos and
Les gens sont en face, qui tirent dessus.
in fact it was entirely different.
Et c'est totalement différent.
What I noticed is the psychological suffering of the people.
Ce qu'il a remarqué le plus, c'est comment les gens souffrent psychologiquement.
Restaurants are open, shops are open,
Tout est ouvert, les restaurants sont ouverts.
and yet you know that 10 kilometers from here there is a front line.
Et la ligne de front est juste à côté.
It's a very strange feeling. People just go about their work, and yet the front lines.
C'est un sentiment très étrange. Les gens ils sortent du travail, ils vont aller sur la ligne de front.
The second thing is that I expected to see violence, a lot of violence, and shootings.
Donc ils s'attendaient à avoir de la violence, des tirs.
But in fact, the reason why it is a civil war is because regular people, old, young men, women, mothers, they arm themselves and they stand on the barricades.
Mais en fait, c'est les femmes, les enfants, les jeunes, ils prennent des armes, ils vont sur les barricades, et c'est pour ça que c'est une guerre civile.
You see husbands stand on the barricades and then the wives come and bring them supper. It's a war which has affected every regular civilian.
Donc en fait, tout le monde est affecté par cette guerre, parce que par exemple, les maris vont sur la barricade et la femme qui habite pas loin lui apporte le souper.
Sometimes the husbands go away for an hour and then the wives stand with them.
Le remplace s'il doit se rendre chez lui faire une sieste.
And the most important part is that the people are actually looking for all means to arm themselves.
Et les gens cherchent tous les moyens de s'armer.
I've seen guys with samurai swords, with hatchets, and I have seen a guy with a real pirate pistol from 200 years old.
Il y a eu des gens armés d'épées ou armés de pistolets de pirates.
And it may seem very funny, but at the moment when you're attacked, you're happy that at least you have that.
Ouais, au moment où il faut faire la guerre, on est content d'avoir le pistolet de pirate.
I've seen people with phone books on their stomachs who thought that it would help them as a bulletproof vest.
Des gens qui utilisent comme une sorte de gilet pare-balles, des cartons.
What we see now in Donetsk is that the city, it's a 1 million people city.
Il y a 1 million de personnes qui vivent à Donetsk.
They have drafted around 27,000 volunteers.
Ils ont
27,000.
200 000.
Basically, as a civil volunteer, you enlist, and you go into the civil protection. You get arms, a weapon, and you go around your normal work. You work, you go with your children, you do several jobs.
On s'inscrit pour s'engager, et on reçoit son arme et après on continue sa vie.
The only way when they're called up is when the enemy army is in the city. Basically, then they just shoot from their windows of their houses.
Donc il n'y a qu'au moment où l'armée ennemie entre dans la ville, donc là ils sont engagés et depuis leur fenêtre ils tirent sur les soldats.
This is regular civil protection, and in fact, in Donetsk, in the main capital city, they didn't have much shooting.
Ils n'ont presque pas tiré, c'est surtout pour se protéger.
The situation is different on the front line in Slaviansk and Kramatorsk.
Donc Slaviansk et Kramatorsk, donc les deux fronts assez différents.
There you can see a modern day warfare.
Et là on voit ce que c'est qu'une guerre.
First of all, the armed groups are mostly men who have military experience, who fought in Afghanistan, in Latin America, in their youth in Soviet armies.
Tout d'abord, là, sur la ligne de front, les gens qui se battent ont une bonne expérience, des gens qui sont battus en Afghanistan ou en Amérique latine.
Well, each one is dressed differently and
Tout le monde est habillé différent.
armed differently. They had some arms from overtaking military bases.
Donc il y a des armes qu'ils ont récupérées en prenant des bases militaires ennemies.
And the most important about Slaviansk and Kramatorsk is that if you look at the map,
Donc le plus important, si on regarde sur la carte,
it is in front of a mountain pass which leads to the capital.
donc c'est juste en face d'un chemin qui mène à la capitale.
So with a small force of men, you can hold off a relatively large army.
Donc ils peuvent réussir avec une plus petite force à contenir une grande armée.
And they're having a last stand or a large stand against a much stronger army at the moment, an army of 15,000 men.
Ils font face à une armée beaucoup plus puissante avec 50 000 soldats.
And what you do not see on the front line, the images that we are used to in the movies as well. You don't see people from a close distance shooting and blowing up each other.
Contrairement au film, on ne voit pas des gens les uns en face des autres se tirer dessus.
The front line is several kilometers apart from each other.
Ils sont chacun à plusieurs kilomètres les uns des autres.
Because of snipers and modern day mini rockets and all other
Des
things.
snipers et des lance-roquettes.
And nobody wants to die.
Et personne ne veut mourir.
So the distance is much larger. You just see people shooting somewhere, but you never see results.
Donc c'est des très grandes distances, ils tirent un peu au hasard, mais ils ne voient jamais le résultat de leur tir.
And also, if they come too close, you just either move away or shoot at them and then they move away.
Et dès que quelqu'un vient trop près, il doit repartir ou se faire tirer dessus.
There was a question before whether there were specialist Russian forces in there.
Donc certains demandaient s'il y avait des forces russes, spéciales russes sur place.
I haven't seen any.
Il n'y en a aucune.
And also, I have a friend who went to East Ukraine to volunteer for civil defense, and he wasn't accepted because he didn't have a local passport.
Un de ses amis a voulu s'engager volontaire, mais il a été refusé parce qu'il n'avait pas le passeport local.
There are a couple of guys who are accepted who have high military experience.
Ils acceptent quelques personnes qui ont une grande expérience militaire.
These guys are volunteers from Russia, and they have come by their own idea.
Donc c'est des volontaires qui viennent de Russie, mais qui sont venus par eux-mêmes.
As you might imagine, almost everybody in Russia has family who fought in the Second World War against fascism.
Donc presque toutes les familles russes ont des ancêtres qui ont combattu le fascisme pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale.
So for most men, it's not a question of honor, it's just a question of duty, and they consider East Ukraine as part of their people who are being killed by fascists. That's why they volunteer to fight there.
Donc ils se portent volontaires parce qu'ils perçoivent ça comme la suite du combat contre le fascisme. Ils vont défendre leurs frères d'Ukraine de l'Est qui sont menacés par le fascisme.
The other part is that there are high civilian losses every night. They are systematic, from 5 to 10 people. Sometimes, if we're lucky, 2 or 3, either by bombings or because targeting of snipers.
Une dizaine de morts par jour quand on a de la chance 2 ou 3, soit à cause des bombardements, soit à cause des snipers.
And I remember the most dramatic scene is when during a victory day, that is the 9 May in Russia.
Donc le 9 mai, c'est le jour des célébrations de la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale.
It is one of the greatest national festivities. It is like Christmas in all West Europe.
comme Noël en France.
because everyone has family. Even my grandfather liberated Kiev.
Tout le monde a de la famille qui a participé, qui a souffert de la guerre.
They collected around 150 volunteers on the main square in Donetsk.
Donc ils ont rassemblé des volontaires à Donetsk.
Those people were standing on the celebration, and then directly from the celebration they were sent to the front line in order to, because at the same day in Mariupol people were shot at from the military.
Donc le jour même des festivités à Mariupol, il y a eu des attaques et donc du coup ils ont été envoyés directement sur le front, ceux qui faisaient les célébrations.
It's a very dramatic scene. You saw men from the same city. You saw their wives hugging them. You saw there was a classmate who was a man of 50 years old and
c'est une scène très triste. Donc on voit les gens, ils doivent embrasser leurs femmes, faire leurs adieux à leur famille.
They would give them flowers and they would jump and hug them because it's a very dramatic scene. You see your relatives going to the front line and you know they might never come back.
Ce jour-là, donc le jour censé célébrer la victoire sur le nazisme.
They go from this main celebrity into the front lines.
Ils vont directement sur les lignes de front.
And that's what I have seen from war. And
c'est ce qu'il a vu de la guerre.
the second part, which was important for me to know, is from scientific point of view how to hold a referendum.
Et la deuxième partie, c'est comment tenir un
of independence. As you might understand, there have been certain criteria formed in order to legitimize the referendum.
Donc il faut certains critères pour que le référendum soit considéré comme légitime.
The first of all is that the central government in Kiev did not anymore exercise any effective control over its territory.
Tout d'abord, il faut que le gouvernement central de Kiev n'ait plus aucun contrôle sur le territoire.
The second is that the civil population did not accept, or the civil population or the military part did not accept the authority of the central government.
J'ai dit qu'il faut que la population civile et les militaires sur place n'acceptent plus du tout l'autorité du gouvernement central.
This is mainly due to three reasons.
Et ça, c'est le cas pour trois raisons.
The first one is that of the Nazi background.
Tout d'abord à cause des nazis au gouvernement.
The second of all, something that not many people in Europe realize, is that the new government is not a new government. It's all same people who were in power for 20 years.
Donc quelque chose qui n'a pas du tout été remarqué en Europe, c'est qu'en fait ceux qui sont au gouvernement actuellement, c'est des gens qui étaient déjà au pouvoir avant. Donc c'est pas un nouveau gouvernement.
There are over 300 millionaires and billionaires in the parliament.
Il y a 300 millionnaires et milliardaires dans le parlement ukrainien.
How many millionaires are in the parliament of France?
Combien il y en a en France?
And so the people, yes, and it is very important to realize that the region within which I was
c'est important de réaliser que la région où il était
actually resembles the Spanish Civil War.
Ressemble beaucoup à la guerre civile de 1967, la guerre d'Espagne.
Because what has happened is that more than 80% was owned by one oligarch.
Alors en fait, la situation, c'était que 80% des entreprises, de ce qu'il y avait sur place, étaient détenues par un seul oligarque.
Everything, restaurants, shops,
les restaurants,
toilets, whatever.
C'était le monopole d'un oligarque.
And so the people didn't have small businesses, and they were not corrupt. They were never corrupt by property thinking, by consumatorism.
C'est-à-dire qu'ils n'étaient pas corrompus, disons, par l'esprit occidental de consommation.
And they still remember, and most of them are mine workers or metal workers. It's a real working class man.
Donc la plupart d'entre eux, c'est des ouvriers dans les mines, c'est une vraie classe ouvrière.
And they remember the days in the Soviet Union when they had very high wages and very good life.
Et ils ont tous connu à l'époque soviétique ce que c'était que d'avoir un bon salaire et des conditions de bonnes conditions de vie.
So the class consciousness of these people who are actually now there on the barricades is very high.
Donc leur conscience de classe est énorme.
So it's one of the few places where it's still this way.
C'est une très rare place au monde, un des rares endroits au monde où il y a autant de conscience de classe.
This means that the situation which has formed itself, any new government which might be formed on the place, can turn any way, can turn even towards socially oriented ideas.
Donc ça veut dire qu'il y a la possibilité pour qu'un nouveau gouvernement local aille vers des idées socialistes.
The other part why Ukraine does not exist anymore as an effective government is that there's no state monopoly on violence.
Alors quelque chose qu'il faut souligner, c'est qu'il n'y a plus d'autorité du gouvernement, y compris il n'y a plus de monopole du gouvernement sur sa propre violence.
Different oligarchs have different armies,
En fait,
which are
les
against
armées
civil population.
gouvernementales, c'est différentes armées détenues par différentes oligarques.
If you look at the videos, there are little green buses from Privatbank from Kolomoisky, which support the military and tanks.
Donc, quand on regarde des vidéos, on voit certains militaires avec derrière eux des camions verts qui appartiennent à un oligarque qui détient la plus grande banque.
It would be the same as you would see money buses from the French bank driving around Africa with the
Comme
military.
si derrière, dans une opération militaire française, on voyait des camions de la BNP derrière certains soldats.
And the two last simple ideas is there's no budget, there's no effective budget anymore. All money is dependent of abroad investments, especially of
Et le dernier point pour dire que cet État n'a plus du tout de souveraineté, en fait, c'est qu'il n'a même pas son propre budget, il dépend totalement de l'argent qu'il reçoit de l'étranger, de l'UE ou du FMI.
And the people have no perspective for progressive development within any new government which might be formed.
Et donc les Ukrainiens de l'Ouest, ils n'ont plus aucune perspective de gouvernement progressiste par aucun gouvernement qui pourrait arriver.
So this is what I have seen, perhaps the most. It is a hard situation, and yet
Donc c'est ce qu'il a vu.
I hope that the people in that region will achieve their livelihoods,
Donc j'espère que les gens de la région vont pouvoir vivre.
especially now that certain cities have been surrounded and there's a humanitarian catastrophe as they are not even allowed to bring medicine into the cities.
Et en plus, il y a une catastrophe humanitaire qui est en train de se produire, spécialement dans certaines villes, le gouvernement central n'autorise plus
There's shortage of insulin and other.
la distribution d'insuline, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a un blocage, un blocus
And how would you call a government?
des médicaments.
How would you call a government which allows blockade of
Comment
medicine,
appelleriez-vous un gouvernement qui fait un blocus sur les médicaments,
or which surrounds the city with grot installations?
qui assiège une ville et tire des roquettes?
It's like modern day Katyusha. It's a weapon which indiscriminately can destroy half of the city.
C'est les Katyushas, ils bombardent avec des Katyushas, donc c'est des roquettes pas du tout précises.
If it's a peaceful mission.
Et ça s'appelle une mission de pacification.
Thank you very much.
Et je vais maintenant passer la parole à Georgi Shepelev.
Et maintenant, je vais laisser la parole à Olivier Berrier, qui va nous faire une présentation générale de la situation en Ukraine. En fait, c'est...
Bonsoir. Donc moi j'anime un blog qui est normalement plutôt économique. C'est un blog économique français, lescrises.fr, et j'ai regardé d'assez près les négociations en 2013 entre l'Union européenne et l'Ukraine, étant assez inquiet de la tournure des événements et me demandant comment ça allait pouvoir finir dans notre position. Évidemment ça a très bien fini. Donc depuis 3 mois, je suis quasiment exclusivement la situation en Ukraine. Donc, ce que je vous propose, c'est de rebalayer ce qui s'est passé ces derniers mois et de faire connaissance avec ce pays, en particulier avec son sympathique gouvernement depuis 2 mois. Comme il y a des élections présidentielles, vous savez, pour un premier tour dimanche, je vous propose de revenir sur la présidentielle précédente, qui opposait Yanukovych à Timoshenko. Déjà, et ce qui est intéressant là-dedans, c'est qu'évidemment Yanukovych a gagné 52% des voix dans une élection que l'OSCE a reconnue tout à fait légale. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est de voir le gradient des résultats. Ici, vous avez les résultats sur chacune des régions. Vous voyez que le président a été élu essentiellement par à l'est du pays, en bleu. Vous voyez qu'à l'extrême est du pays, il fait un score de 95%, 5% pour son adversaire. Et si vous regardez de l'autre côté du pays, à l'ouest, vous apercevez que Mme Timoshenko fait elle aussi 95% des voix contre 5% pour son adversaire. Donc c'est assez intéressant de voir à quel point on a géographiquement une coupure assez radicale du pays qui correspond en fait à d'autres critères. Et ici on voit à peu près 5 Ukraines assez différentes. Une Ukraine à l'est plutôt en rose qui parle russe, sur l'extrême est qui contient une très forte minorité russe, 40-50%. Une Ukraine centrale, et à l'ouest une Ukraine que j'ai mise en bleu, qui a la particularité d'être historiquement polonaises et autrichiennes. Donc n'a été intégrée dans l'orbite russe qu'en 1945, contrairement au reste du pays qui est depuis 2 siècles dans l'orbite russe, tout en bas. La Crimée, avec petite information très peu diffusée, qui contient 25% d'Ukrainiens contre 60% de Russes et 10% de Tatars. Donc c'est 25-60 normalement la population là-dedans, ce qui est un point important pour savoir finalement où doit se trouver cette région. Un petit mot sur l'évolution du PIB par habitant, très rapidement, où on voit que depuis 1990, il y a eu une chute très forte du PIB, et qu'aujourd'hui encore, le niveau de vie en Ukraine est 20% inférieur à celui qu'il y avait au moment de la chute de l'URSS. Le pays stagne depuis une dizaine d'années dans de grandes difficultés. Pour le situer, on le voit ici en comparant le revenu par habitant depuis 2010 entre différents pays. Donc l'Ukraine est en bleu, au milieu, avec pas loin de 4 000 $ par an et par habitant. C'est la moitié du niveau de vie roumain, c'est le tiers du niveau de vie de la Russie. C'est bien moins que le niveau de vie en Irak ou en Namibie, encore moins qu'en Tunisie. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est de savoir que le salaire minimal en Ukraine est de 100 € par mois, donc 30% de moins qu'en Chine. Pour la suite des événements, ça a son importance. En 2013, enfin d'ailleurs même plus tôt, ça commence déjà, c'est un projet qui est très vieux, de signer un accord d'association entre l'Union européenne et l'Ukraine, qui dispose toujours à ce jour d'un accord de libre-échange Ukraine et on va dire Russie. Et donc l'idée était de discuter pendant plusieurs années, de signer un accord d'association Ukraine-Union européenne avec aussi un accord de libre-échange. Évidemment, il ne peut pas y avoir accord de libre-échange à la fois avec ces deux zones différentes. Enfin, en tout cas, la Russie ne peut pas l'accepter puisque ça reviendrait à ce qu'elle-même soit du coup en libre-échange avec l'Union européenne, ce qui ne peut pas supporter son économie. Donc avec toute la finesse qui les caractérise, Manuel Barroso a bien rappelé début 2013 qu'un pays ne pouvait pas être à la fois en libre-échange avec l'Union européenne et avec la Russie, donc ce qui veut dire très clairement que l'Ukraine devait choisir son camp entre l'Union européenne et la Russie. Et Vladimir Poutine a bien précisé en même temps aussi en 2013 que c'était une grande menace pour l'économie russe, ce qui est une évidence. Pour bien comprendre, c'est un peu comme si on avait un accord de libre circulation des personnes, c'est l'exemple que je prends souvent, entre l'Algérie et l'Espagne. Imaginez ces deux pays se mettent à négocier un accord de libre circulation des personnes. Comme par ailleurs l'Espagne a un accord Schengen avec la France, ça va nous poser quelques difficultés si l'Espagne signe un tel traité. C'est exactement ce qui s'est passé et de façon assez stupéfiante. Je n'ai pas mis les nombres de citations là-dedans. Mais l'Union européenne a clairement dit à la Russie, on ne va pas discuter avec vous, ne faites pas pression sur l'Ukraine, ça ne vous concerne pas. Tout ça terminant fin 2013 par une très jolie situation. Le président ukrainien, voyant qu'il n'arrivait pas à s'en sortir au niveau diplomatique, a dit qu'il faut négocier à 3, ce qui semble assez logique en l'espèce. Sur quoi Herman Van Rompuy a déclaré que quand on signait un accord bilatéral, ce n'était pas pour signer un accord trilatéral. Voilà, donc ça, le niveau d'intelligence géopolitique de l'Union européenne dans cette histoire, donc évidemment, ça a fini par causer de grosses difficultés et le président ukrainien a fini par dire qu'il ne signerait pas l'Union européenne. Puisque précédemment, il avait dit qu'il allait favoriser l'Ukraine à se mettre à niveau, parce que l'Ukraine est le pays le plus pauvre d'Europe, donc évidemment, si elle se met en libre-échange avec l'Union européenne, il faut qu'elle mette à niveau son économie, ses normes. Ce qui n'était pas possible, donc il a demandé de l'argent, donc la première réponse a été vous n'aurez rien, en fait, puisqu'on vous ouvre déjà l'Union européenne, donc ça devrait vous suffire. Très belle déclaration de François Hollande aussi au sommet de Vilnius, qui dit que en fait, on ne va pas payer l'Ukraine pour qu'elle nous rejoigne, circuler, il n'y a rien à voir. En discutant un peu, ils étaient prêts à lui donner 600 millions d'euros par an, sachant que la Russie a proposé 20 milliards d'euros par an, c'est un écart qui a fait que l'Ukraine a fini par ne pas réfléchir non plus pendant des heures, et a signé un accord avec la Russie le 17 décembre 2013, qui a déclenché, ce qui a déclenché l'Euromaïdan, c'était vraiment la non-signature prévue de l'accord avec l'Union européenne. Donc on était en pleine période de manifestations, évidemment, où des centaines de milliers de personnes, la plupart venues de l'Est, de l'Ouest quand même, et de Kiev, ont protesté contre la décision du président, sachant qu'au niveau des sondages, c'était 50-50, le pays est très partagé, donc quand on demande au pays où il veut aller, la moitié des gens disent on veut aller plutôt vers la Russie, et l'autre moitié on veut aller plutôt vers l'Union européenne. Et ce qui est formidable, c'est que c'est plutôt 95% des gens à l'Est qui disent on veut aller avec la Russie, 95% des gens à l'Ouest qui veulent aller vers l'Union européenne. il y a eu une pression aussi des oligarques ukrainiens pour signer l'accord avec l'Union européenne plutôt, parce que c'est plus intéressant pour eux plutôt que de rester avec la Russie. C'est pour ça que, enfin, ce qui est assez peu unique, l'ancien président, qui a été élu par à l'Est par les Russes, a quand même décidé de négocier avec l'Union européenne, donc c'était un vrai renversement d'alliance. Et maintenant on le qualifie assez hâtivement de pro-russe, alors qu'il est là, justement, qu'il y a la Russie qui se détournait d'elle pour négocier avec l'Union européenne. C'était une reconstruction a posteriori de la réalité historique. Donc au Euromaidan, plusieurs centaines de milliers, enfin ça démarre à quelques milliers de personnes, plusieurs centaines de milliers de personnes début décembre, qui manifestent aussi pour faire plus de démocratie. Enfin c'était quand même une démocratie l'Ukraine, pas une démocratie très accomplie, qui n'était pas optimale au niveau des libertés. Au niveau des libertés, ça se classait comme la Turquie et comme le Mexique. Donc c'était pas un paradis, pas non plus, c'était pas la Tunisie de Benet. Donc plusieurs centaines de milliers de personnes qui demandent ça, qui demandent à lutter contre la corruption, qui très rapidement demandent le départ du président. Qui est pourtant légitimement élu, avec, comme on l'a très bien dit, un défilé assez ahurissant de à peu près toute la diplomatie occidentale, de Madame Hollande, qui est la ministre américaine des Affaires étrangères, qui va en effet distribuer du pain, et une manifestation qui est en train de demander le départ du président. Je vous demande ce qu'on penserait si des ministres russes venaient soutenir la LCR qui demanderait, place de la Bastille, le départ de François Hollande. Enfin, on trouverait ça quand même, je pense, assez étrange. D'ailleurs, on est tous, hein. Carl Bildt, il est venu Catherine Ashton, il est venu, enfin, c'est hallucinant. Le ministre polonais, le ministre suédois, ont tous défilé à Maïdan. Maïdan, d'ailleurs, je vois que sur la photo, vous voyez les drapeaux rouges et noirs, sont les drapeaux de premier secteur ou de l'UPA, qui sont des drapeaux de partis clairement néo-nazis. Juste pour l'anecdote, l'Afro Yanukovych, dans le sondage ici réalisé le 26 décembre 2013, donc en plein Euromaidan, était quand même donné vainqueur du premier tour avec 36% des voix, ce qui pourrait faire rêver en termes de score certains présidents actuels de certains pays occidentaux que je ne nommerai pas. Vous remarquez que Yatsenyuk, qui est aujourd'hui Premier ministre, fait quand même royalement 7% des voix, ce qui est assez intéressant, bon, même si on fait rajouter Timoshenko à 11, enfin ça fait pas des choses terribles. Voilà, donc le 1er décembre, 500 000 manifestants pacifiques. Il ne s'agit pas de dire non plus que les 90% des gens sur Maïdan étaient des démocrates qui demandaient un accord avec l'Union européenne, ce qui est très bien. C'est pas pour ça qu'ils avaient forcément raison. Normalement, la voie pour choisir le destin d'un pays est déjà primo d'abord des élections, enfin voter, et puis on peut voir quelles sont les conséquences aussi pour ceux qui refusent cet accord. Mais c'est pas à vous aussi que je vais apprendre que 500 000 personnes dans la rue, ça arrive aussi chez nous, et que généralement ils n'ont pas gain de cause, et que généralement ils n'entraînent pas le départ du président de la République. Donc il y a eu des choses supplémentaires à Maïdan qui ont été quand même assez peu montrées, de façon assez étonnante. J'écoutais encore Bernard Kouchner il y a 2 jours sur le film Maïdan qui parle assez peu de ces événements-là, qui met un jour sur ce qui est formidable, c'est vrai, des gens démocrates qui manifestent super, mais qui ne parlent pas des 10% de miliciens clairement néo-nazis. Vous en voyez quelques-uns à droite qui prennent les armes pour, au fur et à mesure, se battre contre les forces de police. La situation bascule le 18 février, puisque le 18 février, il y a 10 flics, 10 policiers qui sont abattus par balle, donc 10 morts. Ce qui entraîne évidemment une réaction du pouvoir qui donne l'autorisation aux policiers de répliquer l'arme réelle sur uniquement les miliciens qui leur tirent dessus, évidemment pas sur les civils. Donc des snipers d'origine douteuse aussi tirent le 20 sur les civils, c'est les 80 à 100 morts de Maïdan. La semaine dernière est sorti le bilan définitif pour les forces de l'ordre. Le bilan de Maïdan du côté des forces de l'ordre, c'est plus de 1100 policiers hospitalisés, dont 196 policiers blessés par balle et 17 policiers morts. Donc, comme révolution démocratique, c'est quand même assez particulier. Quelques images aussi assez peu vues des manifestants pacifiques. Ici, il y avait quelques discussions avec les Berkouts qui ont commis aussi, les CRS locaux qui ont commis aussi des exactions, ça je peux aussi dire, mais bon, de là à dire que la violence est que d'un côté, c'est assez exagéré. Ici, vous voyez les militants de Svoboda dont on va parler, qui sont quand même en train de gentiment gazer les forces de l'ordre à l'intérieur d'un bâtiment. Et ici, j'ai la bascule après du pouvoir avec, là encore, des manifestants pacifiques qui regardent d'assez près les forces de l'ordre, comme ici aussi également. Pour ceux qui ont les armes, en effet, des événements qui sont assez importants. Alors ça c'est Maïdan à Kiev, il se passe aussi des choses ces 2-3 jours-là dans le pays. Ici vous voyez un événement assez peu relaté, avec le secrétaire du Parti communiste de Lviv, qui est pris à partie, battu, torturé, et qui a fini par quitter le pays, évidemment, après toutes ces exactions de Maïdan. Quoi qu'il en soit, le 21 février, un accord a été signé normalement entre le président et la majorité, et les partis d'opposition, qui prévoyaient des élections présidentielles anticipées dans l'année. Il faut savoir qu'il ne restait plus qu'un an au président à tenir avant que les élections arrivent. C'était prévu pour 2015, les élections. Et donc, le 21 est signé cet accord avec la présence de la France, de la Pologne, de l'Allemagne, qui mettent tous un grillé sur le papier en disant c'est bon, on va faire comme ça. Mais le lendemain, Maïdan refuse cet accord et les miliciens annoncent qu'ils vont aller s'emparer du président de la République qui fuit le 22. Et le 27 est nommé un nouveau gouvernement. Vous voyez ici, il se rend rapidement aux États-Unis. Et à gauche, vous avez le nouveau président, et à droite, le nouveau Premier ministre, qui font partie du parti Patrie de Timoshenko. La destitution du président était totalement inconstitutionnelle aussi, pas respecter du tout les procédures adaptées. Et dans ce gouvernement, on compte des choses assez amusantes. Vous avez 6 ministres qui ont appartenu à des organisations clairement néo-nazies, fascistes, dont 4 au parti Svoboda, dont on va parler, plus 4 néo-nazis sont aussi à d'autres postes très importants, comme les forces armées et le procureur de Kiev. Il y a 2 partis représentés au gouvernement. Vous avez le parti Patrie et le parti Svoboda, puisque les deux ont passé un accord en 2012, vous les voyez ici. Donc vous retrouvez le Premier ministre actuel et le président actuel en train de discuter tranquillement avec Oleg Tyanibok, qui est le leader de Svoboda, dont on va dire quelques mots. Svoboda, ça veut dire liberté, mais ça ne s'appelle comme ça que depuis 2004, parce que quand le parti a été créé en 1991, il s'appelait le Parti national social d'Ukraine. Ça n'invente pas. Hein. Son logo, vous le voyez en plein milieu, en jaune, ce N avec un I, qui est exactement en effet miroir le logo de la division SS des Reich qui a rasé au radio sur Glane. En 2004, ils ont changé, ils ont pris le logo bleu avec le trident, qui est aussi un signe néo-nazi. Le directeur du centre, Simon Wiesenthal, a bien précisé que Svoboda est composé des mêmes éléments que les auxiliaires ukrainiens des nazis qui ont commis des massacres de masse de juifs, de russes et de polonais. Ce qui est assez intéressant, une petite carte avec ses résultats électoraux législatifs de 2012. Il faut savoir qu'ils font de très mauvais scores au présidentiel, puisque les Ukrainiens préfèrent voter directement pour celui qui va gagner au deuxième tour. Donc ils font 1, 2, 3% au présidentiel, mais ils ont fait 10% aux législatives. Ce qui est surtout intéressant, c'est de voir qu'ils ont surtout fait 1% chez les Russes et qu'ils ont fait 37, 38% dans la région de Lviv, la région qui était en bleu tout à l'heure sur la carte. Vous voyez qu'ils sont vraiment un terrain fort de ces personnes-là. Faisons encore un petit peu la connaissance du leader qui a rencontré donc, tous les diplomates de la planète, Fabius, tous les ministres, Catherine Ashton, il était là partout dans les négociations. En 2009, donc, il négociait dans Marine Le Pen, vous voyez en bas, vous voyez quelques interventions qui montrent qu'il prend un accord sur le métier de parlementaire, ce qui est assez intéressant. Voilà, Oleg Tyanibok, mais ce qui est pas mal aussi, c'est qu'en 2012, il a quand même été award du top 10 des antisémites de l'année. Par le centre Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, vous le connaissez tous, grand chasseur des nazis, il faut savoir qu'il était ukrainien et qu'il a survécu à la région de Lviv, donc la région de ces gens-là, qui est une des régions qui ont eu le taux de mortalité de la Shoah le plus élevé, 90 à 95% des juifs sont morts. C'est un des rares survivants, Simon Wiesenthal, donc sa fondation est assez sensible à ce qui se passe évidemment là-bas. Mais c'est intéressant aussi de connaître les députés de Svoboda, puisqu'ils en ont quand même maintenant une trentaine. Donc là, vous en voyez quelques-uns. Tout en haut, vous en voyez un sur des photos qui ont 1 an, puisqu'il est allé tranquillement à des joyeuses cérémonies de réanimation de Waffen-SS, puisqu'évidemment, de temps en temps, ils en redéterrent. Et là, donc, vous les voyez à l'église, tous habillés en Waffen-SS, en train de les réunimer, donc avec le député Svoboda. À droite, vous avez une autre députée Svoboda qui se recueille sur un endroit où sont tombés beaucoup de Waffen-SS, avec un déguisé encore en Waffen-SS devant. Tout en bas, à gauche, vous voyez 2 autres députés en train de montrer, ça ne se voit pas trop sur la photo, deux petits chiffres qui sont 14 et 88, qui sont 2 chiffres de reconnaissance des néo-nazis. 88 parce que la 8e lettre de l'alphabet c'est le H, donc 88 ça fait HH à Hitler, c'était une façon pour eux de se reconnaître, donc là ils posent gentiment devant ça, au milieu. Vous avez un député qui est allé boxer au mois de mars le directeur de la télé, le directeur de France Télé locale, parce qu'il avait diffusé le discours de Poutine sur la Crimée. Et donc il a roué de coups et devant la caméra, en fait, le gars a signé sa démission et il a été éjecté comme ça de la télévision. Ça s'est passé un petit peu dans les caméras. Voilà, donc la cérémonie, vous voyez, c'est assez intéressant avec la police locale, avec les curés locaux, août 2013 en Ukraine. Trois petites déclarations des députés Svoboda, c'est pas mal aussi quand on les lit, ces gens-là, Irina Farion, qui est une des 2-3 bien connues, qui nous a expliqué mi-avril que pour sa part, finalement, ce qu'il faut faire avec les séparatistes, il faut les fusiller parce qu'ils méritent la mort. Et donc après Odessa, une fois qu'ils ont eu à peu près donc il y a eu cette quarantaine de morts à Odessa, il explique que bravo Odessa, que le diable les brûle en enfer, le 3 mai, le lendemain d'Odessa. Donc la dame est députée de Svoboda. Un autre député qui est lui l'intellectuel de Svoboda, c'est un docteur en sciences politiques qui a créé le centre d'études politiques Joseph Goebbels, qui a fait toute une thèse sur la prise de pouvoir par les nazis et par les fascistes, tout en insistant sur comment manipuler les démocraties occidentales avec leurs faiblesses pour arriver à prendre le pouvoir. Quelqu'un qui a dit que la période de l'Holocauste est une période de lumière dans l'histoire. Député très en vue, vous le voyez très souvent dans les réunions Svoboda, et qui a quelques jours a trouvé la solution pour Slaviansk et les séparatistes. Donc il a dit ce qu'on va faire le plus simple, c'est on évacue les populations civiles et puis vous envoyez les bombardiers et les hélicoptères pour raser la ville. Donc au moins comme ça, ce sera réglé. Proposition au Parlement en début de semaine. Bon, allez, je ne vais pas rentrer dans le détail là-dessus. Juste comment, quand même, des gens sérieux ont qualifié Svoboda. Le Congrès juif mondial en 2012 l'a qualifié évidemment de parti néo-nazi. C'est un peu le Parti national-social d'Ukraine, il ne faut pas chercher non plus trop longtemps. En bas à gauche aussi en 2012, vous avez 25% des députés de la Knesset, du Parlement israélien, qui ont écrit au Parlement européen en disant il y a un parti néo-nazi, faites attention, il est très dangereux. Et vous voyez Tzipi Livni, qui a été ancienne ministre des Affaires étrangères d'Israël et ancienne vice-première ministre, qui elle aussi est intervenue à cette époque-là pour dénoncer le parti néo-nazi, Svoboda, c'est ses mots, et surtout en dénonçant la complicité qu'il avait avec les autres partis en Ukraine qui le reconnaissaient et qui travaillaient avec. Donc là, on a parlé de Svoboda, donc de partis. Bon, quand on dit ça, les gens disent exagérés, ces gens-là ont un magnifique discours de BHL, en théorie, qui vous explique que, oh là là, attendez, ces gens-là sont juste d'extrême droite, que l'extrême droite en France c'est 20%, donc c'est moins qu'il y ait que 10% là-bas, c'est pas très important. Du coup, on va regarder sur LCI assez facile, une bonne manipulation, façon de faire passer la pilule. Et ce qu'on dit généralement, c'est pas très grave, bon, c'est vrai qu'ils ont le tiers, c'est comme le tiers du gouvernement, les ministres néo-nazis, mais finalement, c'est pas eux qui décident, c'est pas eux qui ont les postes de Premier ministre. Très bien, en regardant le deuxième parti, que nous posons parfois comme un parti UMP. Donc voilà, vous avez le parti soi-disant UMP qui donc a fait un accord électoral avec le parti néo-nazi. Bon, déjà, c'est un concept intéressant ici. Vous voyez donc le Premier ministre avec Oleg Kanimok. Ils sont assez proches, ils sont assez amis. Donc on va regarder un des députés de Patrie. Ici, c'est Andrei Paroubi. Qui a été reçu, la photo date de lundi dernier. Donc il est reçu à l'OTAN, parce que ce député de Patrie est maintenant responsable de toutes les forces de sécurité d'Ukraine. Donc il conseille le président et il chapeaute toutes les forces de la défense et de l'intérieur. Donc c'est vraiment monsieur force de sécurité en Ukraine, donc il est reçu à l'OTAN. C'est déjà un signal pour la Russie, je pense qu'il doit faire plaisir avec une géostratégie colossale. Mais ce qui est assez amusant, c'est qu'Andrei Paroubi, membre de Patrie, est surtout cofondateur du parti Svoboda en 1991. Et là, vous voyez avec sur une photo, pas terrible, certes, mais avec Jean-Marie Le Pen qui lui a dédicacé à l'époque ses ouvrages. Je dis pas ça pour... j'ai un peu hésité à faire ça, parce que justement, j'ai pas trop envie de rapprocher Svoboda du Front National. C'est vraiment quelque chose qui va au-delà. Et comme l'a dit justement Lipny dans son discours, elle a dit, il faut savoir qu'en 2011, tous les partis d'extrême droite, le Front National, le parti hongrois, dont on parle actuellement, ont rompu avec Svoboda. D'ailleurs, ces gens sont fous, ils sont beaucoup trop extrémistes. Et c'est ce que disait Livni en disant, regardez, même eux ne veulent plus travailler avec Svoboda, ce qui est assez intéressant. Le président d'Ukraine, mardi, vous avez vu cette semaine, c'est d'actualité, a demandé l'interdiction du Parti communiste d'Ukraine. ça c'est donc les partis démocrates, républicains, hein, c'est logique d'aller interdire là-bas le Parti communiste. On va regarder une autre députée de patrie, puisqu'il y a des gens intéressants, qui est Madame Robetz. Vous la voyez, c'était son anniversaire le 3 mai, c'est 32 ans, donc elle a sorti une petite photo d'elle à 32 ans, à gauche, en se rapprochant d'elle à 16 ans. Vous voyez, avec des fusils à pompe à chaque fois dans les mains. Et vous n'aurez sans doute pas à lire, mais son commentaire était très simple, c'était « Les temps changent, les principes restent immuables ». Voilà, donc une députée de patrie, et qu'a-t-elle dit donc, le 3 mai, le lendemain aussi du massacre d'Odessa, elle dit « Les colonies de Dorifor ont été liquidées, les agresseurs ont attaqué perfidement les premiers, ont reçu la réponse adéquate. » Donc 40 morts brûlés. Nous devons encore récupérer la Crimée, mémoire éternelle aux héros, qui sont des slogans déjà des pro-nazis de la guerre. Dernier point, un dernier député de patrie a précisé qu'il a déposé une proposition de loi visant à dépénaliser l'apologie, la justification publique des crimes nazis, des crimes contre l'humanité. C'est assez intéressant. Donc voilà donc le niveau du gouvernement actuel en Ukraine. Ce qui est assez intéressant, c'est la petite manipulation, enfin petite grossière, qu'ils ont réalisée fin avril, puisqu'ils ont donné tout un lot, si vous avez vu. C'est intéressant, ça permet d'illustrer ce que c'est, au final, qu'est-ce que ça fait d'avoir un gouvernement comme ça. Donc ils transmettent un ensemble de pièces à l'OSCE, qui est repris par le New York Times, en disant, regardez, on a la preuve que la Russie est derrière ce qui se passe en Ukraine. Alors que normalement, ça a bien compris qu'il y a un parti comme ça, enfin, qu'il y a un gouvernement où il y a 30% de néo-nazis, 30% de gens qui seraient au FN en France, que 30% de l'UMP, ça doit normalement avoir des conséquences dans le pays, en particulier chez les gens qui souhaitent voir mort. Donc voilà, ils transmettent ces dossiers-là en disant, regardez, on a la preuve que les Russes sont là, et ils disent, regardez, on a des photos, on vous montre qu'il y a des Russes il y a 2 ans, qui étaient en Russie il y a 2 ans, ou en Géorgie il y a 2 ans, on retrouve les mêmes aujourd'hui dans l'Est. Donc regardez, la Russie est derrière tout ça, et il faut nous soutenir, et il faut attaquer la Russie. Donc voilà les photos, sauf que les photos sont moches, vous les voyez, c'est étonnant, très mauvaise qualité. Ils font ça le lendemain, déjà, Internet avait regardé d'assez près ce qui se passait là-dedans, et commençait à bien sourire. Donc en retrouvant les photos originales, cette fois en bonne résolution, donc vous voyez ici donc, les mêmes personnes, hein, je pense que c'est clair, hein, ça saute aux yeux. Les deux en tripartite, vous voyez, c'était voilà, donc la preuve du gouvernement ukrainien. Mais ils en ont fait une deuxième, qui est celle-là, qui est intéressante, pareil, hein, vous avez compris le système. Tout en haut, ça regardez bien en bleu, hein, photo de groupe prise en Russie, avec les personnes cerclées. Vous voyez qu'en bas, il y a une personne qui est cerclée de jaune, c'est bizarre, la photo est coupée très basse, hein, parce que comme ils veulent la zoomer, on ne voit pas le corps du personnage. C'est assez amusant, parce que quand on cherche la photo originale, on la retrouve ici, on voit que c'est là où c'est coupé, si c'est pas coupé, on voit le sol. Et on s'aperçoit qu'en fait, les deux photos qu'il montre sont les photos prises le même jour au même endroit. Donc évidemment que c'est les mêmes personnes qui sont là, n'ont pas du tout été prises en Russie, que c'est aussi une manipulation grossière qui a fait doucement rigoler à Internet le lendemain, qui s'amusait à faire des parodies de ce type. Ce qui est en effet d'un côté risible, mais il faut savoir qu'il y a juste le gouvernement qu'on reconnaît ukrainien qui essaie de nous manipuler pour qu'on ait un conflit avec la Russie. Il y a d'autres très drôles avec Poutine et des ours aussi. Mais voilà, normalement on devrait interrompre toute relation diplomatique avec le gouvernement. Non, on continue tranquillement à le soutenir. C'était normalement la fin de la présentation, mais en finissant tout à l'heure, je suis tombé sur autre chose que je vais vous montrer. Alors, pour les plus sensibles, ne regardez pas, c'est une photo qui est assez choquante. Mais qui date d'aujourd'hui en fait, puisqu'il y a eu secteur 3, qui est donc les sections d'assaut locales, qui servent de garde nationale maintenant au gouvernement, qui ont connu quelques morts aujourd'hui. Donc il y a des vidéos de ces personnes-là, de ces miliciens qui ont été tués par les pro-russes, et donc la vidéo dénonce en effet les terroristes pro-russes qui ont tué les gens de la garde nationale qui défendaient un peu l'ordre du gouvernement. Alors, donc ne regardez pas si vous êtes assez sensible. Et donc dans la vidéo, on voit passer cette image de cet homme de la garde nationale ukrainienne qui est mort. Ce qui est juste intéressant, parce que si vous zoomez là où j'ai cerclé, en fait, vous voyez qu'il a tatoué sur le cœur une croix gammée et dessous un symbole SS. Voilà, ça ne s'apprend pas, c'est pas truqué, vous avez essayé ce matin. Voilà, donc vous avez tous ces néo-nazis qui ont intégré cette garde nationale qui a été faite juste après Maïdan pour recycler tous les miliciens, en plus de l'armée et des forces de police. Et dernière slide, deux petites déclarations, malheureusement un petit peu coupées. Mais une de Carl Bildt, qui est le ministre suédois des Affaires étrangères, qui semble être dans la shortlist pour remplacer Herman Van Rompuy actuellement, qui a déclaré au mois de mars que finalement le gouvernement ukrainien est composé de démocrates européens qui travaillent pour les valeurs qui sont les nôtres. Bon, ceci étant, à bien relire, on comprend peut-être mieux certaines choses au niveau du fonctionnement de l'Union européenne, et il nous explique qu'il ne voit aucun risque que Svoboda se détourne de la voie du développement démocratique, ce que c'est intéressant pour un parti néo-nazi, et que les accusations d'antisémitisme portées contre Svoboda sont de la propagande russe, qui donc a priori infiltre pas mal d'organisations juives. Et la dernière, qui est quand même la plus forte, c'est Laurent Fabius, qui est quand même le collecteur, du 11 mars 2014, qui nous explique qu'il faut être pragmatique. Et tout ça n'est pas très grave, parce que le gouvernement là-bas, il essaie vraiment de rassembler, de faire un gouvernement d'union nationale, donc nazi plus FN plus PMP, hein, l'union nationale, qu'il essaie de rassembler des gens qui ont pignon sur rue, Svoboda a pignon sur rue, donc lui il comprend tout à fait ça, vous n'avez pas tout à fait compris pour ma part, et il finit en disant que Svoboda, qui n'est pas un parti, c'est un parti qui est plus à droite que les autres, mais il n'est pas d'extrême droite au sein du gouvernement, donc voilà, vous jugerez un peu de la situation actuelle du gouvernement ukrainien, et évidemment des répercussions que ce genre de gouvernement ne peut qu'avoir sur le fonctionnement et la pérennité d'un pays aussi fragile qu'est l'Ukraine.
Moi, je vais dire juste un mot sur un élément qui est très peu abordé dans les débats, en particulier télévisés, c'est le rôle des États-Unis. Alors, je le fais rapidement pour laisser le temps aux autres d'intervenir. Vous entendez régulièrement poser la question, quelle est la stratégie de la Russie? Qu'est-ce que veut Poutine en Ukraine? Alors, c'est pas pour nier que la Russie est une stratégie et une volonté qui s'exprime dans les événements en Ukraine, ce qui est tout à fait normal pour tout État, mais on pose rarement la question quelle est la stratégie des États-Unis, puisque cela impliquerait qu'ils en aient une et qu'elle ait conduit aux événements tels qu'ils sont actuellement. Alors je vais juste rappeler quelques éléments que nous considérons importants. Les États-Unis, ce sont 700 à 800 bases militaires réparties un peu partout sur Terre, entre 300 et 400 000 militaires dans le monde entier, dans 150 pays. Rien qu'en Europe, il y en a 67 000, alors que l'ensemble des forces européennes des 28 pays de l'Union européenne représentent 1 600 000, 1 700 000 soldats. Donc on ne voit pas très bien l'importance fondamentale d'avoir 67 000 Américains supplémentaires sur le territoire européen. Par ailleurs, les États-Unis ont un passé qui ne plaide pas pour eux dans les interventions extérieures. On pourra citer quelques événements, comme le renversement de Mossadegh en Iran en 1953, qui a été remplacé par le Shah d'Iran, l'intervention au Chili, avec la mise en place de Pinochet, Diem au Vietnam, ou encore récemment l'assistance apportée au renversement de Zelaya au Honduras. Juste quelques éléments sur des manières qui ne sont pas toujours les plus démocratiques, alors que l'attitude actuellement, en particulier des États-Unis en Ukraine, est présentée comme un pays qui réagit, qui vient en défense d'un pays agressé par son grand voisin, la Russie. Il est fort possible que ce conflit en Ukraine ait commencé peu après la prise de fonction de François Hollande, le 20 mai 2012, puisque ça a été la première sortie de notre président, s'est faite au sommet des chefs d'État de l'OTAN, à Chicago, où il a signé le bouclier antimissile, qui, pour tous ceux qui s'intéressent à la question, a été immédiatement perçu par la Russie comme un retour à la course aux armements, en tout cas une menace directe, qui s'est ajoutée à l'avancée de l'OTAN à l'Est, alors qu'il y a eu, certes, pas des accords signés, mais au moins des promesses faites qu'il n'y aurait pas d'extension de l'OTAN à l'Est. Et les derniers éléments d'Ukraine sont perçus par les stratèges russes comme encore une avancée de l'OTAN, beaucoup trop près de leurs frontières, et donc il n'est pas étonnant qu'ils aient réagi. Voilà, quelques mots encore sur certains éléments de l'ingérence américaine. Pour ceux qui ont suivi, on a vu très tôt arriver sur le Maïdan McCain, divers sénateurs, Madame Nuland, qui était très respectueuse de l'Union européenne, a distribué même des pains sur le Maïdan dans une sorte d'allégorie christique de son action et de l'action des États-Unis. Joe Biden, le vice-président, est de nombreuses fois présent sur le Raidan. Le chef de la CIA est venu avant les événements et les offensives lancées à l'Est, jusqu'au fils de Joe Biden, qui est un peu comme le fils de Sarkozy, nommé une sorte d'EHPAD géante, qui est le plus gros consortium gazier d'Ukraine. Ce qui montre quand même, bon, quelques touches comme ça, la forte ingérence américaine en Ukraine.